Why had it been allowed? Pressing one end of the rod hard with her thumb, the one power was not enough by itself. She sat down heavily and leaned against the chair's low back, staring at the thing in her hand. It was done. She felt hollow now, a vast empty space with fears fluttering through the darkness like enormous bats. Instead of rewrapping the Turangrial, she tucked it into her belt pouch and got up long enough to stuff the box back into the wardrobe. Until she knew she was safe, she did not intend to let that rod out of her possession. But then all she could do was sit and wait, rocking back and forth with her hands clasped between her knees. She could not stop rocking any more than she could stop the low moans that trickled between her teeth. Since the founding of the tower, no sister had ever been charged with being Black Aja. Oh, there had been suspicions by individual sisters, and from time to time, Aes Sedai had died to make sure those suspicions never went further, but never had it come to official charges. If Elida was willing to speak openly of the headsman's block, she must be close to bringing charges. Very close. Black sisters had been made to disappear, too, when suspicions grew too great. The Black Aja remained hidden, whatever the cost. She wished she could stop moaning. Suddenly, the light in the room dimmed, enveloping the chamber in swirling twilight shadows. The sunlight at the casements seemed unable to penetrate beyond the glass panes. Alviarin was on her knees in a breath, eyes down. She trembled with wanting to pour out her fears, but with the chosen, the forms must be followed. "I live to serve, great mistress," she said, and nothing more. She could not waste a moment, much less an hour, screaming in pain. Her hands were clutched together to keep them from shaking. "What is your grave emergency, child?" It was a woman's voice, but a voice of crystal chimes. Displeased chimes. Only displeased. Angry chimes might have meant death on the spot. "If you think I will raise a finger to get the Keeper's stole back for you, you are sadly mistaken. You can still do what I wish done with a little extra effort, and you may consider your penances with the Mistress of Novices a small punishment from me. I did warn you about pushing Elida quite so hard." Alviarin swallowed her protests. Elida was not a woman to bend without hard pushing. Masana had to know that. But protests could be dangerous with the chosen. Many things were dangerous with the chosen. In any case, Sylviana's strap was a trifle compared to the headsman's axe. "Elida knows, great mistress," she breathed, raising her eyes. In front of her stood a woman of light and shadow, clothed in light and shadow, all stark blacks and silvery whites that flowed from one to the other and back. Silver eyes frowned from a face of smoke, with silver lips drawn in a tight line. It was only illusion, and really not done any better than Alviarin could have. A flash of green silk skirt embroidered with elaborate bands of bronze showed as Masana glided across the Damani carpet. But Alviarin could not see the weaves that made the illusion any more than she had felt those the woman had used to arrive or cast the room in shadows. For all she could sense, Masana could not channel at all. The lust for those two secrets usually cut at her, but today she hardly noticed. "She knows I am Black Aja, great mistress. If she has uncovered me, then she has had someone dug in deep. Dozens of us may be at risk, perhaps all of us. Best to make a threat as large as possible if you wanted to be sure of a response. It might even be so." But Masana's response was a dismissive wave of one now silver hand. Her face glowed like a moon around eyes blacker than coals. "That is ridiculous. Elida cannot decide from one day to the next whether she even believes the Black Aja exists. You are just trying to save yourself a little pain. Perhaps a little more will instruct you in your error." Alviarin began to plead as Masana raised that hand higher, and a weave she remembered much too well formed in the air. She had to make the woman understand. Abruptly, the shadows in the room lurched. Everything seemed to shift sideways as the darkness thickened in midnight lumps. And then the darkness was gone. Startled, Alviarin found herself with her begging hands stretched up toward a blue blue-eyed woman of flesh and blood, garbed in bronze-embroidered green. A tantalizingly familiar woman who looked just short of her middle years. She had known Masana walked the tower disguised as one of the sisters, though no chosen she had met showed any sign of agelessness. But she could not match that face to any name, and she realized something else as well. That face was afraid, hiding it, but afraid. "She's been very useful," Masana said, not sounding afraid at all, in a voice that tugged the edge of recognition. "And now I will have to kill her."
"You were always overly wasteful,"
replied a harsh voice, like rotten bone crumbling underfoot. Alviarin froze in shock at the tall shape of a man in sinuous black armor, all overlapping plates like the scales of a snake, standing in front of one window. It was not a man, though. That bloodless face had no eyes, just smooth, dead white skin where they should have been. She had encountered Myrddraal before in the service of the Dark Lord, and even managed to meet their eyeless gazes without giving way to the terror those stares engendered. But this one made her scrabble back across the floor until her back jarred a leg of the table. Lurks were alike as two raindrops, tall and lean and identical, but this one stood a head taller, and fear seemed to radiate from it, soaking into her bones. Unthinking, she reached for the source, and nearly screamed. The source was gone. She was not shielded. There was simply nothing there for her to embrace. The Myrddraal looked at her and smiled. Lurks never smiled. Never. Her breath came in ragged panting.
"She can be useful,"
the Myrddraal rasped.
"I would not want the Black Aja destroyed."
"Who are you to challenge one of the chosen?" Masana demanded contemptuously, then ruined the effect by licking her lips.
"Do you think Hand of the Shadow is just a name?"
The Myrddraal's voice no longer grated. Hollow, it seemed to boom down caverns from some unimaginable distance. The creature grew as it spoke, swelling in size till its head brushed the ceiling over 2 spans up.
"You were summoned, and you did not come. My hand reaches far, Masana."
Shaking visibly, the chosen opened her mouth, perhaps to plead, but suddenly black fire flashed around her, and she screamed as her clothing fell away in dust. Bands of black flame bound her arms to her sides, wrapped tight around her legs, and a seething ball of black appeared in her mouth, forcing her jaws wide. She writhed there, standing naked and helpless, and the look in her rolling eyes made Alviarin want to soil herself.
"Do you want to know why one of the chosen must be punished?"
The voice was a bone-grating rasp once more, the Myrddraal seemingly only a too tall lurk, but Alviarin was not fooled.
"Do you want to watch?"
it asked. She should go face down on the floor, grovel for her life, but she could not move. She could not look away from that eyeless stare. "No, great lord," she managed with a mouth as dry as dust. She knew it could not be, but she knew. Tears were rolling down her cheeks, she realized. The Myrddraal smiled again.
"Many have fallen from great heights for wanting to know too much."
It flowed toward her. No, not it. The great lord, clothed in the skin of a Myrddraal, flowed toward her. He walked on legs, yet there was no other description for the way he moved. The pale, black-clad shape bent toward her, and she would have shrieked when he touched a finger to her forehead. She would have shrieked if she could have summoned any sound at all. Her lungs were airless sacs. The touch burned like red-hot iron. Vaguely, she wondered why she did not smell her own flesh burning. The great lord straightened, and the searing pain dwindled, vanished. Her terror did not lessen in the slightest, though.
You are marked as mine, the Great Lord rasped. Masana will not harm you now, unless I give her
I'll be
permission.
right back.
You will find who threatens my creatures here, and deliver them to me.
He turned away from her, and the dark armor fell from his body. She was startled when it hit the carpeted floor tiles with a crash of steel, rather than simply vanishing. He was clothed in black, and she could not have said whether it was silk or leather or something else. The darkness of it seemed to drink the light from the room. Masana began to thrash in her bonds, keening shrilly past the gag in her mouth.
Go now,
He said.
if you wish to live another hour.
The sound coming from Masana rose to a despairing scream. Alviarin did not know how she got out of her rooms. She could not understand how she was upright when her legs felt like water. But she found herself running through the corridors, skirts pulled to her knees and running as hard as she could. Suddenly, the head of a wide staircase loomed in front of her, and she barely managed to stop from running right out into the air. Sagging against the wall, shaking, she stared down the curving flight of white marble steps. In her mind, she could see her body breaking as it crashed down the stairway. Breathing raggedly, in hoarse, raw-throated pants, she put a trembling hand to her forehead. Her thoughts tumbled one over another as she would have down the stairs. The Great Lord had marked her as his. Her fingers slid across smooth, unblemished skin. She had always prized knowledge. Power grew from knowledge. But she did not want to know what was happening in the rooms she had left. She wished she did not know that anything was happening. The Great Lord had marked her, but Masana would find a way to kill her for knowing that. The Great Lord had marked her and given her a command. She could live if she found who was hunting the Black Aja. Straightening her back with an effort, she hurriedly scrubbed at the tears on her cheeks with the heels of her palms. She could not pull her eyes away from the stairs falling away in front of her. Elida surely suspected her, but if there was no more to it than that, she could always manufacture a hunt. It just had to include Elida herself as a threat to be extinguished. Delivered to the Great Lord. Her fingers fluttered to her forehead again. She had the Black Aja at her command. Smooth, unblemished skin. Talene had been there, in Elida's rooms. Why had she looked at Yukiri and Doacine that way? Talene was black, though she did not know that Alviarin was, of course. Would any mark show in a mirror? Was there something that others could see? If she had to manufacture a scheme for Elida's supposed hunters, Talene might be a place to start. She tried to trace the route any message would have taken from heart to heart before it reached Talene, but she could not stop staring down the stairs, seeing her body bounce and break its way to the bottom. The Great Lord had marked her. Chapter 22. One Answer. Pavara waited with a touch of impatience while the slim little accepted placed the rimmed silver tray on a side table and uncovered the dish of cakes. A short woman with a serious face, Pedra was not being laggard or resentful over having to spend the morning fetching and carrying for a sitter, just precise and careful. Those were useful qualities to be encouraged. Still, when the accepted asked whether she should pour the wine, Pavara said crisply, "We will do for ourselves, child. You may wait in the anteroom." She almost told the young woman to go back to her studies. Pedra spread her banded white skirts in a graceful curtsy without any sign of being flustered, the way accepted often were when a sitter showed snappishness. All too frequently, accepted took any bite in a sitter's tone as an opinion on their fitness for the shawl, as if sitters had no other concerns. Pavara waited until the door closed behind Pedra and the latch clicked before nodding approvingly. "That one will be raised Aes Sedai soon," she said. It was satisfying when any woman attained the shawl, but especially when the woman had appeared unpromising to begin with. Small pleasures seemed the only ones available these days. "Not one of ours, though, I think," was the reply from her surprising guest, who turned from a study of the row of painted miniatures of Pavara's dead family that stood in a line on the wave-carved marble mantel above the fireplace. "She's uncertain about men. I believe they make her nervous. Tarna certainly had never been nervous about men or very much of anything else, at least not since she reached the shawl just over 20 years ago. Pavara could remember a very jumpy novice, but the pale-haired woman's blue eyes were steady as stones now, and about as warm as stones in winter. Even so, there was something in that cool, prideful face, something in the set of her mouth that made her seem uneasy this morning. Pavara could hardly imagine what might make Tarna Fair nervous. The real question, though, was why the woman had come to see her. It bordered on impropriety for her to visit any sitter privately, particularly a Red. Tarna still maintained her rooms here in the Red Quarter, but so long as she held her new position, she was no longer part of the Red Aja, despite the crimson embroidery on her dark gray dress. Delaying the move to her new apartment might be taken as a show of delicacy by those who did not know her. Anything out of the ordinary made Pavara wary, since Siain had pulled her into hunting the Black Aja, and Elida trusted Tarna just as she had trusted Galena. It was wise to be very cautious with anyone Elida trusted. Just thinking of Galena, the light burned the woman forever, still set Pavara's teeth on edge. But there was a second connection. Galena had taken a special interest in Tarna as a novice, too. True, Galena had taken an interest in any novice or accepted she thought might join the Red, but it was another reason for caution. Not that Pavara let anything show on her face, of course. She had been Aes Sedai too long for that. Smiling, she reached for the long-necked silver pitcher that sat on the tray, giving off the sweet scent of spices. "Will you take wine, Tarna, in congratulation for being raised?" Silver goblets in hand, they settled on spiral-worked armchairs, a style that had gone out of fashion in Kandor near 100 years ago, but one that Pavara liked. She saw no reason to change her furniture or anything else according to the whims of the moment. The chairs had served her since they were new made, and they were comfortable with the addition of a few cushions. Tarna sat stiffly, however, on the edge of her seat. No one had ever called her languid, but clearly she was uneasy. "I am not certain congratulations are in order," she said, fingering the narrow red stole draped around her neck. The exact shade was not prescribed, except that anyone who saw it must call the color red, and she had chosen a brilliant scarlet that nearly shone. Elida insisted, and I could not refuse.
Hey,
Much has
Mix, how you
changed
doing,
since I
bro?
left the tower, inside as well as out.
Hope you're doing good.
Alviarin made everyone watchful of the Keeper.
And
I
thanks for
suspect
stopping
some will
by.
want her birched when she finally returns. And Elida... She paused to sip at her wine, but when she lowered the goblet, she went on in a different vein. "I have often heard you called unconventional. I have even heard that you once said you would like to have a warder." "I've been called worse than unconventional," Pavara said dryly. What had the woman been about to say concerning Elida? She sounded as though she would have refused the Keeper's stole, given her wishes. Strange. Tarna was hardly shy or shrinking. Silence seemed best, especially about warders. She had been talking too much, if that was general gossip. Besides, keep silent long enough and the other woman always spoke, if only to fill up the gap. You could learn a great deal through silence. She sipped her own wine slowly. There was too much honey in it for her taste, and not enough ginger. Still stiff, Tarna rose and strode to the fireplace, where she stood staring at the miniatures sitting on their white lacquered stands. She raised a hand to touch one of the ivory ovals, and Pavara felt her own shoulders tighten in spite of herself. Georg, her youngest brother, had been only 12 when he died, when all of the people in those paintings died, in an uprising by dark friends. They had not been a family who could afford ivory miniatures, but once she had the coin, she found a painter who could capture her memories. A beautiful boy, Georg, tall for his years and utterly fearless. Long after the event, she had learned how her baby brother died, with a knife in his hand, standing over their father's body and trying to keep the mob from their mother. So many years ago now. They would all have been long dead in any case, and their children's children's children as well. But some patrons never died. The dragon reborn is Taviran, so I have heard, Tarna said finally, still staring at Georg's picture. Do you think he alters chance everywhere? Or do we change the future by ourselves, one step following another until we find ourselves somewhere we never expected? What do you mean? Pivara said, a trifle more curtly than she could have wished. She did not like the other woman peering at her brother's image so intently while talking of a man who could channel, even if he was the dragon reborn. She bit her lip so as not to tell Tarna to turn around and look at her. You could not read someone's back the way you could a face. I anticipated no great difficulty in Salidar. No great success either, but what I found... Was that a shake of her head? Or had she merely changed the angle at which she was peering at the miniature? She spoke slowly, but with an undercurrent of remembered urgency. I left a pigeon handler a day outside the village, yet it took me less than half a day to get back to her. And after I loosed the birds with copies of my report, I pressed on so hard I had to pay the woman off because she could not keep up. I can hardly say how many horses I went through. Sometimes the animal was spent to the point I had to show my ring to make a stable take it in trade, even with silver added. And because I pressed so hard, I happened to reach a village in Murundi while a recruiting party was there. If I had not been frightened out of my wits for the tower by what I saw in Salidar, I would have ridden to Ebudar and taken ship for Ilion and then upriver. But the thought of going south instead of north, the thought of waiting for a vessel, sent me like an arrow toward Tarvalin. So I was in that village to see them. Who, Tarna? Ashaman. The woman did turn then. Her eyes were still blue ice, but tight. She held her goblet in both hands as if trying to soak in the warmth. I did not know what they were then, of course, but they were openly recruiting men to follow the Dragon Reborn, and it seemed wisest to listen before I spoke. Well for me that I did. There were 6 of them, Pivara. 6 men in black coats. 2 with silver swords on their collars were feeling men out about whether they might like to learn to channel. Oh, they did not say so right out. Wield the lightnings, they called it. Wield the lightnings and ride the thunder. But it was clear enough to me, if not to the fools they were talking to. Yes, very well for you that you kept silent, Pivara said quietly. 6 men who can channel would be more than merely dangerous for a sister by herself. Our eyes and ears are full of talk about these recruiting parties. They appear everywhere from Saldeia to Tyr, but no one seems to have an idea of how to stop them, if it isn't too late already. She very nearly bit her lip again. That was the trouble with talking. Sometimes you said more than you wanted. Oddly, the comment took some of the stiffness out of Tarna. She resumed her seat, leaning back, though a hint of wariness still clung to the way she held herself. She chose her words carefully, pausing to touch the wine to her lips, but she did not actually drink, that Pivara saw. I had a long time to think on the river ship coming north. Longer after the fool captain ran us aground so hard he broke a mast and put a hole in the hull. Days trying to hail another ship after we got ashore, and days finding a horse. 6 of those men sent to one village convinced me, finally. Oh, the district around as well, but it was not very populous. I believe it is too late. Elida thinks they can all be gentled, Pivara said non-committally. She had already exposed herself too much. When they can send 6 to one small village and travel, there is only one answer I can see. Tarna took a deep breath, fingering the bright red stole again, but now it seemed more in regret than to play for time. Red sisters must take them as warders, Pivara. That was so startling that Pivara blinked. A hair less self-control, and she would have gaped. Are you serious? Those icy blue eyes met her gaze steadily. The worst was past, the unthinkable spoken aloud, and Tarna was a woman of stone once more. This is hardly a matter for joking. The only other choice is to let them run loose. Who else can do it? Red Sisters are used to facing men like this and ready to take the necessary risks. Anyone else will flinch. Each sister will have to take more than one, but Greens appear to manage well enough with that. I think the Greens will faint if this is suggested to them, though. We, Red Sisters, must do what needs to be done. Have you broached this to Elida? Pivara asked, and Tarna shook her head impatiently. Elida believes as you said. The yellow-haired woman frowned into her wine before going on. Elida often believes what she wants to believe, and sees what she wants to see. I tried to bring up the ashram on the first day. Not to suggest bondage, I am not a fool. She forbade me to mention it to her. But you are unconventional. And do you believe they can be gentled after they're bonded? I have no idea what that would do to the sister holding the bond, and in truth, I don't want to learn. She was the one playing for time, Pivara realized. She had had no idea where this interview was headed when it began, but she would have wagered everything she owned against it coming to this. That might be the end, and it might prove impossible, the other woman replied coolly. The woman was stone. Either way, I can see no other way to handle these Ashaman. Red Sisters will own them as warders. If there is any way, I will be among the first, but it must be done. She sat there, calmly sipping her wine, and for a long time, Pivara could only stare at her in consternation. Nothing Tarna had said proved she was not Black Aja, yet she could not distrust every sister on her. Well, she could, and did, when it came to matters of the Black, but there were other matters she had to deal with. She was a sitter, not simply a hunting dog. She had the White Tower to think of, and Aes Sedai far from the tower, and the future. Dipping her fingers into her embroidered belt pouch, she drew out a small piece of paper rolled into a thin tube. It seemed to her that it should glow with letters of fire. So far, she was one of 2 women in the tower who knew what was written on it. Even once she had it out, she hesitated before handing it to Tarna. This came from one of our agents in Kyrian, but it was sent by Tovain Gazal. Tarna's eyes jerked to Pivara's face at the mention of Tovain's name, then fell to reading again. Her stony face did not change even after she finished, and let the paper roll back into a tube in her hand. This changes nothing, she said coldly. It only makes what I suggest more urgent. On the contrary, Pivara sighed. That changes everything. It changes the whole world. Chapter 23. Ornaments. The air in the room was significantly warmer than outside, with the glass panes set in the red painted curtains, and the glass vessels besides. But Ketswain was peering out as if she could see the dreary landscape clearly. She could see with more than enough clarity in any case. A few hapless folk, bundled and hatted, and only shapeless skirts or baggy breeches distinguishing men from women, were trudging the muddy fields that surrounded the manor house, sometimes stooping to feel a handful of the soil. It would not be long before they could begin their plowing and manuring, but only their inspection indicated the coming of spring any time soon. Beyond the field, the forest was all dark, bare branches against a washed-out gray morning sky. A good coating of snow would have made the view much less bleak, but it snowed lightly and seldom, with traces of one barely lasting until the next. Still, she could think of few places better for her purposes, with the spine of the world little more than a day's hard ride to the east. Who would think to look inside the borders of Tyr? Had convincing the boy to stay here been too easy, though? With a sigh, she turned from the window, feeling the golden ornaments hanging in her hair sway, the small moons and stars, birds and fish. She was very aware of them of late. Aware? Fall. Of late she had considered sleeping with them in place. The sitting room was large, but not ornate, like the manor house itself, with cornices of carved wood painted red. The furniture was bright with paint, but not a touch of gilding. The two long fireplaces, plain stone, if well made, the andirons sturdy wrought metal made for long service rather than appearances. The fires on the hearths were small, at her insistence, the flames flickering low on half-consumed splits. But either was enough to warm her hands, which was all she wanted. Left to his own devices, Algarin would have surrounded her with blazing warmth and smothered her in servants, few as he still employed. A lesser lord of the land, he was far from wealthy, yet he paid his debts in letter and spirit, even when most other men would have seen quite the reverse of a debt. The uncarved door to the hall creaked open. Most of Algarin's servants were nearly as old as he, and though they kept everything dusted and neat, the lamps topped with oil and the wicks trimmed, hinges in the manor seemed to escape regular oiling. The door creaked open to admit Varen, still dressed for a journey in simple brown wool with divided skirts, and holding her cloak over her arm, patting her gray-streaked hair into place. The stout little sister's square face wore a vexed expression, and she was shaking her head. Well, the sea folk are delivered to tear, Cadswain. I didn't go near the stone, but I heard that High Lord Astoril stopped complaining about his creaking joints and mustered inside with Darlin. Who'd have thought Astoril would stir himself and on Darlin's side? The streets are full of armsmen, most getting drunk and picking fights with each other when they're not fighting à Anier. There are as many sea folk in the city as everyone else put together. Harina was aghast. She went rushing out to the ships as soon as she could hire a boat, expecting to be declared mistress of the ships and set everything to rights. There seems no doubt that Nested in Rias is dead. Cadswain was content to let the round little woman chatter on. Varen was not nearly so vague as she pretended. Some Browns really were capable of tripping over their own feet from not noticing them, but Varen was one of those who wore an assumed cloak of unworldliness. She seemed to believe that Cadswain accepted the cloak for reality, yet if there was a point to be made, she would make it. And what she left out might be revealing too. Cadswain was less sure of the other sister than she might have wished. Uncertainty was a fact of life, but she was uncertain about entirely too many things to suit her. Unfortunately, Min must have been listening at the door, and that young woman had little patience. I told Harina it wouldn't be like that, she protested, bursting into the room. I told her she'd be punished for the bargain she made with Rand. Only after that will she become mistress of the ships, and I can't say if it will be 10 days from now or 10 years. Slim and pretty and tall in her red-heeled boots, with dark ringlets hanging to her shoulders, Min had a low, womanly voice, but she wore a boy's red coat and blue breeches. The coat was embroidered with colorful flowers on the lapels and up the sleeves, and the breeches in bands down the outsides of the legs, but they were still coat and breeches. You may come in, Min, Cadswain said quietly. It was a tone that usually made people sit up and take notice. Those who knew her at all, anyway. Spots of color appeared in Min's cheeks. The Wave Mistress has already learned all she is going to from your viewing, I fear. But from your urgency, perhaps you've read someone else's auras and wish to tell me what you saw? The girl's peculiar ability had proved helpful in the past, and doubtless could again. Perhaps. As far as Cadswain could tell, she did not lie about what she saw in the images and auras that she perceived floating around people, but it was not always forthcoming either. Particularly not when it came to the one person Cadswain would have liked to know about above all others. Red cheeks or no red cheeks, Min raised her chin stubbornly. She had changed since Shadar Logoth. It had begun earlier, but either way, the change was not for the better. Rand wants you to come see him. He said to ask, so you needn't get snippy over it. Cadswain merely looked at her and let the silence stretch. Snippy? Definitely not for the better. Tell him I will come when I am able, she said finally. Close the door firmly behind you, Min. The young woman opened her mouth as if to say something more, but at least she retained sense enough to leave it unsaid. She even made a
Hey,
possible
Zoe, how
curtsy
you doing?
in spite of those ridiculous
Hope you're
looks,
doing well.
and shut the door firmly behind her, just barely short of slamming it, in fact. Varen shook her head again, giving a laugh that sounded only slightly amused. She's in love with the young man, Catswain, and she's tucked her heart in his pocket. She'll follow that before her head, whatever you say or do. I think she's afraid he almost died on her, and you know how that can make a woman determined to hang on. Catswain's lips thinned.
How's your day going,
Varen
Zoe?
knew more about that
Or
sort
evening,
of
should I
relations
say?
with men than she did. She had never believed in indulging with her own warders, as some Greens did, and other men had always been out of the question. But the Brown had hit close to a truth without knowing. At least, Catswain did not think the other sister knew Min was bonded to the Althor boy. She herself only knew because the girl had let too much slip in a careless moment. Even the tightest muscle eventually yielded its meat once you got that first small crack in the shell. Sometimes it gave up an unexpected pearl as well. Yes, Min would want to keep the lad alive whether she loved him or not, but no more than Catswain did. Draping her cloak on the tall back of a chair, Varen moved to the nearest
Hell yeah,
fireplace
Zoe.
and stretched out her hands to warm them in front of the low flames.
Always
You could
gotta
not
have a
say that
safety
Varen
meeting.
glided, but she was more graceful than her bulk suggested. How much of her was deception? Every Aes Sedai hid behind various masks over time. It became habit after a while. I believe the situation in Tyr may be resolved peacefully yet, she said, peering into the fire. She might have been talking to herself, or wanted Catswain to think it. Herna and Simon are growing quite desperate, afraid the other High Lords will return from Ilion and trap them in the city. They may be amenable to accepting Darlin, given their other choices. Estanda is made of sterner stuff, but if she can be convinced there's advantage for her in it. I told you not to go near them, Catswain broke in sternly. The stout woman blinked at her in surprise. I didn't. The streets are always full of rumors, and I do know how to piece rumors together and sift out a little truth. I did see Alana and Raphella, but I ducked behind a fellow hawking meat pies from a barrow before they saw me. I'm sure they didn't. She paused, clearly waiting for Catswain to explain why she had been told to avoid the sisters as well. I have to go to the boy now, Varen, Catswain said instead. That was the trouble with agreeing to advise someone. Even when you managed to set all the conditions you could wish for, most of them anyway, you still had to come sooner or later when they called, eventually. But it did give her a reason to evade Varen's curiosity. The answer was simple. If you tried to solve every problem yourself, you ended by solving none. And with some problems, how they were solved really did not matter in the long run. But not answering left Varen with a puzzle to ponder, a little butter for her paws. When Catswain was unsure of someone, she wanted them unsure of her, too. Varen gathered up her cloak and left the room with her. Did the other woman mean to accompany her? But outside the sitting room, they encountered Nasuna walking briskly down the hall. She came to a sudden halt. No more than a handful of people had ever managed to ignore Catswain, yet Nasuna did a credible job, her nearly black eyes latching on to Varen. You're back, then, are you? The best of Browns did have a way of stating the obvious. You wrote a paper on animals of the drowned lands, as I recall, which meant that Varen had. Nasuna recalled everything she had ever seen, a useful skill, if Catswain had been sure enough of her to make use of it. Lord Algaran showed me the skin of a large snake he claims came from the drowned lands, but I'm convinced it is the same as I observed. Varen glanced helplessly at Catswain over her shoulder as the taller woman drew her away.
One second, I'll be right
But before
back.
they were 3 steps along the corridor, she was deep in discussion over this fool snake. It was a remarkable sight, and troubling in a way. Nasuna was loyal to Elida, or had been, while Varen was one of those who wanted to pull Elida down, or had been. Now they talked amiably about snakes. That both had sworn fealty to the Althor boy could be laid to his being Taviran, winding the pattern around himself unconsciously. But was that oath sufficient to make them ignore their opposition over who held the Amerlin seat? Or were they affected by having a Taviran in close proximity? She would have liked very much to know that. None of her ornaments protected against Taviran. Of course, she did not know what 2 of the fish and 1 of the moons did, but it seemed unlikely they did that. It could have been as simple as Varen and Nasuna both being brown. Browns could forget everything else when they settled to study something. Snakes. Oh. The small ornament swayed as she shook her head before turning away, leaving the 2 receding browns behind. What did the boy want? She had never liked being an advisor, necessary or not. Drafts along the corridors rippled the few tapestries on the walls, all in old styles and showing the wear of having been taken down and rehung many times. The manor house had grown like a rambling farmhouse rather than being built large, with additions added whenever the family's fortunes and numbers waxed. House Pendalone had never been wealthy, but there had been times they were numerous. The results showed in more than worn, old-fashioned wall hangings. The cornices were brightly painted, red or blue or yellow, but the hallways varied in width and height, and sometimes met at a slight skew. Windows that once had looked to the fields now looked down on courtyards, usually bare except for a few benches, and placed purely to provide light. Sometimes there was no choice in getting from here to there except to take a roofed colonnade overlooking one of those courtyards. The columns were wooden more often than not, though bravely painted even where not carved. On one of those walkways, with fat green columns, 2 sisters were standing together watching the activity in the courtyard below. At least they were watching together when Cadsuane opened the door to the colonnade. Beldain saw her step out and stiffened, twitching at the green-fringed shawl she had worn fewer than 5 years. Pretty, with her high cheekbones and a slight tilt to her brown eyes, she had not yet achieved agelessness, and looked younger than Min, particularly when she shot Cadsuane a frosty stare, and hurried from the colonnade in the other direction. Maurice, her companion, smiled after her in amusement, shifting her own green-fringed shawl slightly. Tall and usually quite serious, with her hair drawn back tightly from her pale face, Maurice was not a woman who smiled often. "Beldain, she is becoming concerned that she has no warder yet," she said in the accents of Tarabon as Cadsuane stopped beside her, though her blue eyes returned to the courtyard. "She seems to be considering a shaman if she can find one. I told her to talk to Daigyan. If it does not help her, it will help Daigyan." All of the warders they had with them were gathered in the stone-paved yard, in their shirt sleeves despite the cold, most seated on painted wooden benches watching 2 of their number work with wooden practice swords. Jahar, one of Maurice's 3, was a pretty, sun-dark young man. The silver bells fastened to the ends of his 2 long braids chimed with the fury of his attack. He moved like a striking blacklance. Not a breath of breeze stirred, but the 8-pointed star, like a golden compass rose, seemed to shift against Cadsuane's hair. Had it been held in her hand, she could have felt it vibrating clearly. But then she already knew that Jahar was an Ashaman, and the star would not have pointed him out, merely told her that a man who could channel was nearby. The more men who could channel, the harder the star quivered, she had learned. Jahar's opponent, a very tall, broad-shouldered fellow with a stone face and a braided leather cord around his graying temples to hold back shoulder-length hair, was not the second Ashaman down there, but he was as deadly in his own way. Lan did not really seem to move that fast, but he flowed. His blade of bundled laths was always there to deflect Jahar's, always moving the younger man just a touch more out of his line. Suddenly, Lan's wooden blade struck Jahar's side with a resounding crack, a killing blow given with steel. While the younger man was still flinching from the force of the strike, Lan flowed back into a ready stance, long blade upright in his hands.
The old-fashioned way.
Nethan, another of Maurice's, rose to his feet, a lean fellow with wings of white at his temples and tall, if still a hand or more shorter than Lan. Jahar waved him away and raised his practice blade again, loudly demanding another go. "Is Daigyan still bearing up?" Cadsuane asked. "Better than I expected," Maurice admitted. "She stays in her room too much, but she keeps her weeping private." Her gaze shifted from the men dancing their swords to a green-painted bench, where Varen's stocky, gray-haired Tomas sat next to a grizzled fellow with only a fringe of white hair remaining. Dahmer, he wanted to try his healing on her, but Daigyan refused. She may never have had a warder before, but she knows that the grieving over a dead warder is part of remembering him. I am surprised that Coril would consider allowing it. With a shake of her head, the Taraboner's sister returned to studying Jahar. Other sisters' warders did not really interest her, at least not like her own. Shaman, they grieve as warders do. I thought perhaps Jahar and Dahmer merely followed the lead of the others, but Jahar, he says it is their way too. I did not intrude, of course, but I watched them drink in memory of Daigyan's young Eben. They never mentioned his name, but they had a full wine cup sitting for him. Basana and Nathan, they know they can die on any day, and they accept that. Jahar expects to die. Every day he expects it. To him, every hour is most assuredly his last. Cadsuane barely refrained from glancing at the other woman. Maurice did not often go on at such length. The other woman's face was smooth, her manner unruffled. Something had upset her. "I know you practice linking with him," she said delicately, peering down into the courtyard. Delicacy was required in talking to another sister about her warder. That was part of the reason she stared into the courtyard, frowning. "Have you decided yet whether your boys succeeded at Shadar Logoth? Did he really manage to cleanse the male half of the source?" Corey practiced linking with Dahmer, too, but the yellow was so focused on her futile efforts to reason out how to do with Saidar what he did with Saidin that she would not have noted the Dark One's taint sliding down her throat. A pity she herself had not come to the shawl 50 years later than she had, or she would have bonded one of the men herself and had no need to ask. But 50 years would have meant that Norla died in her little house in the Black Hills before Cadsuane Malydran ever went to the White Tower. That would have altered a great deal of history. For one thing, it would have been unlikely that she would be in anything approaching her present circumstances. So she asked, delicately, and waited. Maurice was quiet and still for a long moment, and then she sighed. "I do not know, Cadsuane. Saidar is a calm ocean that will take you wherever you want, so long as you know the currents and let them carry you. Saidin, an avalanche of burning stone, collapsing mountains of ice. It feels cleaner than when I first linked with Jahar, but anything could hide in that chaos. Anything." Cadsuane nodded. She was not sure she had expected any other answer. Why should she find any certainty about one of the two most important questions in the world when she could find none on so many simpler matters? In the courtyard, Lan's wooden blade stopped, not with a crack this time, just touching Jahar's throat, and the bigger man flowed back to his waiting stance. Nethan stood again, and again Jahar waved him back, angrily raising his sword and setting himself. Maurice's third, Basana, a short, wide fellow, nearly as sun-dark as Jahar, for all he was Kyrianan, laughed and made a rude comment about over-ambitious men tripping on their own blades. Tomas and Dahmer exchanged glances and shook their heads. Men of that age usually had given up taunting long ago. The clack of wood on wood began once more. The other 4 warders were not the only audience for Lan and Jahar in the courtyard. The slim girl with her dark hair in a long braid, watching anxiously from a red bench, was the focus of Cadsuane's frown. The child would need to flash her great serpent ring under people's noses to be taken for Aes Sedai, which she was. if just technically. It was not only because Nynaeve's face was a girl's face. Beldain still seemed as young. Nynaeve bounced on the bench, always on the point of leaping up. Occasionally her mouth moved as if she were silently shouting encouragement, and sometimes her hands twisted as though demonstrating how Lan should have moved his sword. A frivolous girl, full of passions, who only rarely demonstrated that she had a brain. Min was not the only one to have thrown her heart and head both down the well over a man. By the customs of dead Malkir, the red dot painted on Nynaeve's forehead indicated her marriage to Lan, though Yellows seldom married their warders. Very few sisters did, for that matter. And of course Lan was not Nynaeve's warder, however much he and the girl pretended otherwise. Who he did belong to was a matter they evaded like thieves slipping through the night. More interesting, more disturbing, was the jewelry Nynaeve wore. A long gold necklace and slim gold belt with matching bracelets and finger rings, the gaudy red and green and blue gems that studded them clashing with her yellow-slashed dress. And she wore that peculiar piece as well on her left hand, golden rings attached to a golden bracelet by flat chains. That was an angreal, much stronger than Cadsuane's shrike hair ornament. The others were much like her own decorations, too, terangreal and plainly made at the same time during the breaking of the world, when an Aes Sedai might find many hands turned against her, most especially those of men who could channel. Strange to think that they had been called Aes Sedai, too. It would be like meeting a man called Cadsuane. The question, her morning seemed filled with questions, and the sun not halfway to noon yet. The question was, did the girl wear her jewelry because of the Althor boy? Or the Ashaman? Or because of Cadsuane Malydron? Nynaeve had demonstrated her loyalty to a young man from her own village, and she had shown her wariness of him as well. She did have a brain when she chose to use it. Until that question was answered, however, trusting the girl too far was dangerous. The trouble was, little these days did not seem dangerous. Jahar is growing stronger, Maurice said abruptly. For an instant, Cadsuane frowned at the other green. Stronger? The young man's shirt was beginning to cling damply to his back, while Lan appeared not to have broken his first sweat. Then she understood. Maurice meant in the power. Cadsuane only raised a questioning eyebrow, though. She could not recall the last time she had let shock reach her face. It might have been all those years ago in the Black Hills when she began earning the ornaments she now wore. At first, I thought the way these Ashaman train, the forcing, had pushed him to his full strength already, Maurice said, frowning down at the two men working their practice blades. No, it was at Jahar she was frowning. Just a faint crinkle of her eyes, but she reserved her frowns for those who could see and know her displeasure. At Shadar Logos, I must be imagining it. 3 or 4 days ago, I was convinced I was mistaken. Now, I'm sure I am correct. If men gain strength by fits and starts, there is no saying how strong they will become. She did not voice her obvious worry, of course, that he might grow stronger than she. Saying such a thing would have been unthinkable on many different levels, and while Maurice had become somewhat accustomed to doing the unthinkable, most sisters would faint at the very idea of bonding a man who could channel. She was never comfortable giving them voice. Cadsuane was, yet she kept her voice neutral. She hated being delicate. Hated the necessity, anyway. He seems content, Maurice. Maurice's warders always seemed content. She handled them well. He is in a fury of... The other woman touched the side of her head, as though fingering the bundle of sensations she felt through the bond. She really was upset. Not rage, frustration. Reaching for the worked leather belt bag, she took out a small enameled pin, a sinuous figure in red and gold, like a snake with legs and a lion's mane. I do not know where the Althor lad got this, but he gave it to Jahar. Apparently for Ashaman, it is akin to attaining the shawl. I had to take it away, of course. Jahar, he is still at the stage where he has to learn to accept only what I say he can. But he is so agitated over the thing. Should I give it back to him? In a way, it would come from my hand then. Catswain's eyebrows began to climb before she could control them. Maurice was asking advice about one of her warders? Of course, Catswain had suggested she sound the man out in the first place, but this degree of intimacy was unthinkable. Faugh. I'm sure whatever you decide will be correct. With one last glance at Nynaeve, she left the taller woman stroking the enameled pin with her thumb and frowning down into the courtyard. Lan had just defeated Jahar once more, but the young man was squaring up again, demanding yet another match. Once her nerves decided, she had already learned one thing she did not like. The boundaries between Aes Sedai and warders had always been as clear as the connections. Aes Sedai commanded and warders obeyed. But if Maurice, of all people, was dithering over a collar pin, Maurice, who managed her warders with a firm hand, then new boundaries would have to be worked out, at least with warders who could channel. It seemed unlikely that bonding them would stop now. Beldain was evidence for that. People never really changed, yet the world did, with disturbing regularity. You just had to live with it, or at least live through it. Now and then, with luck, you could affect the direction of the changes, but even if you stopped one, you only set another in motion. As expected, she did not find the door to the Althor boys' rooms unguarded. Olivia was there, of course, seated on a bench to one side of the door with her hands folded patiently in her lap. The pale-haired Shanshan woman had appointed herself the boy's protector of sorts. Olivia credited him with freeing her from a Damani's collar, but there was more to it than that. Men disliked her, for one thing, and it was not the usual sort of jealousy. Olivia hardly seemed to know what men and women did together. But there was a connection between her and the boy, a connection revealed in glances that carried determination on her side, and on his, hope, hard as that was to believe. Until Cadswain knew what that was all about, she intended to do nothing to separate them. Olivia's sharp blue eyes regarded Cadswain with a respectful wariness, but she did not see an enemy. Olivia had a short way with those she considered the Althor boys' enemies. The other woman on guard was much of a size with Olivia, but the two could not have been more different, and not just because Elza's eyes were brown, and she had the smooth, ageless look of Aes Sedai, where Olivia had fine lines at the corners of her eyes, and threads of white almost hidden in her hair. Elza leaped to her feet as soon as she saw Cadswain, drawing herself up in front of the door and wrapping herself tight in her shawl. "He is not alone," she said, frost rhyming her voice. "Do you mean to stand in my way?" Cadswain asked, just as coldly. The Andorran green should have moved aside. Elza stood far enough below her in the power that she should not have hesitated, much less waited for a command, but the woman planted her feet, and her gaze actually grew heated. It was a quandary. 5 other sisters in the manor house had sworn fealty to the boy, and those who had been loyal to Elida all stared at Cadswain as if suspicious of her intentions toward him, which raised the question of why Varen did not, of course. But only Elza tried to keep her away from him. The woman's attitude was jealousy, which made no sense. She could not possibly believe herself better suited to advise him, and if there had been any suggestion that Elza desired the boy as a man or a warder, men would have been snarling. The girl had finely honed instincts there. Cadswain would have ground her teeth, had she been the sort of woman to grind her teeth. At the point when she thought she would have to order Elza to step aside, Olivia leaned forward. "You did send for her, Elza," she drawled. "He'll be upset if we keep her out. Upset with us, not her. Let her in." Elza glanced at the Shanshan woman from the corner of her eye, and her lip curled in contempt. Olivia stood far above her in the power, well above Catswain for that, but she was a wilder and a liar in Elsa's view. The dark-haired woman hardly seemed to accept that Olivia had been Damani, much less the rest of her story. Still, Elsa darted a look at Catswain, then at the door behind her, and shifted her shawl. Plainly, she did not want the boy upset. Not with her. "I'll see whether he's ready for you," she said, very near to sullen. "Keep her here," she added to Olivia more sharply before turning to knock lightly at the door. A male voice called from the other side, and she opened the door just wide enough to slip in, pulling it shut behind her. "You'll have to forgive her," Olivia said, in that irritatingly slow, soft Shanshan accent. "I think it's just that she takes her oath very seriously. She isn't used to serving anyone." "Aes Sedai keep their word," Catswain replied dryly. The woman made her feel as if her own way of talking were as quick and crisp as tiny linens. "We must." "I think you do. Just so you know, I keep my word, too. I owe him anything he wants of me." A fascinating comment, and an opening. But before she could take advantage of it, Elsa came out. Behind her came Algarin, white beard trimmed to a neat point. He offered Catswain a bow, with a smile that deepened the wrinkles of his face. His plain coat of dark wool, made in his younger days, hung loosely on him now, and the hair on his head provided a thin covering. There was no chance to find out why he had been visiting the Althor boy. "He will see you now," Elsa said sharply. Catswain very nearly did grind her teeth. Olivia would have to wait. And Algarin. The boy was on his feet when Catswain entered, almost as tall and broad-shouldered as Lan, in a black coat worked with gold on the sleeves and the high collar. It was too much like an Ashaman's coat with embroidery added to suit her, but she said nothing. He made a courteous bow, ushering her to a chair with a tasseled cushion in front of the fireplace, and asking whether she would like wine. That in the pitcher, sitting on a side table with 2 wine cups, had gone cold, but he could send for more. She had worked hard enough to force him into civility. He could wear any coat he wanted. There were more important matters he had to be guided in, or prodded, or pulled as need be. She was not going to waste time or talk on his clothing. Inclining her head politely, she declined the wine. A wine cup offered many opportunities. To sip when you needed a moment's thought, to peer into when you wished to hide your eyes, yet this young man needed watching every moment. His face gave away almost as little as a sister's. With that dark reddish hair and those blue-gray eyes, he could have passed for Aiel, but few Aiel had eyes that cold. They made the morning sky she had been staring at earlier seem warm, colder than they had been before Shadar Logoth. Harder, too, unfortunately. They also looked weary. Algarin had a brother who could channel, he said, turning toward a facing chair. Halfway into the turn, he staggered. He caught himself on an arm of the chair with a barked laugh, pretending he had tripped over his own boots. But there had been no tripping. And he had not seized Saidin. She had seen him stagger doing that, or her ornaments would have warned her. Coreel said he only needed a little more sleep to recover from Shadar Logoth. Light, she needed to keep the boy alive, or it had all been for nothing. "I know," she said. And since it seemed Algarin might have told him everything, she added, "I was the one who captured Imarin and took him to Tarvalon." A strange thing for Algarin to be grateful for, in some eyes, but his younger brother survived being gentled for more than 10 years after she had helped him reconcile to it. The brothers had been close. The boy's eyebrows twitched as he settled into his chair. He had not known. "Algarin wants to be tested," he said. She met his gaze levelly, serenely, and held her tongue. Algarin's children were married, those who still lived. Maybe he was ready to turn this piece of land over to his descendants. In any case, one man more or less who could channel hardly made any difference at this point. Unless it was the boy who was staring at him. After a moment, his chin moved, the vestige of a nod. Had he been testing her? Never fear that I'll fail to tell you when you're being a fool, boy. Most people remembered that after one meeting, she had a sharp tone. This young man required reminding from time to time. He grunted. It might have been a laugh. It might have been rueful. She reminded herself that he wanted her to teach him something, though he did not seem to know what. No matter. She had a list to choose from, and she had only begun on it. His face might have been carved from stone for all the expression he showed, but he bounded to his feet and began to pace back and forth between the fireplace and the door. His hands were clenched in fists behind his back. "I've been talking with Olivia about the Shanshan," he said. "They call their army the ever-victorious army for a reason. It's never lost a war. Battles, yes, but never a war. When they lose a battle, they sit down and work out what they did wrong or what the enemy did right. Then they change what needs changing for them to win." "A wise way," she said when the flow of words paused. Plainly, he expected some comment. "I know men who do the same. Davram Bashir, for one. Gareth Bryn, Rodel Eteralda, Agelmar Jagad. Even Pedro Nile did when he was alive. All judged great captains." "Yes," he said, still pacing. He did not look at her, perhaps did not see her, but he was listening. It was to be hoped that he actually heard as well. "5 men, all great captains. The Shanshan all do it. That's been their way for 1,000 years. They change what they have to change, but they don't give up." "Are you considering the possibility they can't be defeated?" she asked calmly. Calmness always suited until you knew the facts. And usually after, too. The boy rounded on her, stiff-necked and eyes like ice. "I can defeat them eventually," he said, struggling to keep his tone civil. That much was to the good. The less often she had to prove that she could and would punish transgressions of her rules, the better. "But—" He cut off with a growl as the sounds of argument in the hallway penetrated the door. A moment later, the door swung open, and Elsa backed into the room, still arguing in a loud voice and trying to hold back 2 other sisters with her spread arms. Arian, her pale face flushed with color, was pushing the other green ahead of her physically. Serene, a woman so beautiful she made Arian look almost ordinary, wore a cooler expression, as might be expected from a white, but she was shaking her head in exasperation, and hard enough to make the colorful beads in her thin braids click together. Serene possessed a temper, though she normally kept it sealed away tightly. "Bartol and Rashan do be coming," Ariane announced loudly, agitation thickening Ilion in her speech. Those were her 2 warders left behind in Kyrian. "I did no send for them, but someone did travel with them. An hour ago I felt them suddenly closer, and just now closer again. They're coming toward us now." "My Vitalian, he also is coming closer," Serene said. "He will be here in a few hours, I think." Elsa let her arms drop, though from the stiffness of her back she was still glaring at the 2 sisters. "My Fieril will be here shortly as well," she muttered. He was her only warder. It was said they were married, and Greens who married seldom took another warder at the same time. Cadswain wondered whether she would have spoken if the others had not. "I didn't expect it so soon," the boy said softly. Softly, but there was steel in his voice. "But I shouldn't have expected events to wait on me, should I, Cadswain?" "Events never wait on anyone," she said, standing. Ariane flinched as if she had just noticed her, though Cadswain was sure her face was as smooth as the boy's, and maybe as stony at that. What had brought those warders from Kyrian, and who had traveled with them, might be problems enough to go on with. She thought she had gotten another answer from the boy, and she was going to have to consider very carefully how to advise him on it. Sometimes the answers were thornier than the questions.
Chapter 24. A Strengthening Storm. Mid-afternoon sunlight should have been slanting through the windows of Rand's bedchamber, but a hard rain was falling outside, and all the lamps were lit to hold off a twilight darkness. Thunder rattled the glass-filled casements in the windows. It was a fierce storm that had rolled down out of the dragon wall faster than a running horse and brought a deeper cold, almost deep enough for snow. The raindrops pelting the house were half-frozen slush, and despite blazing logs in the hearthstone, a chill clung to the room. Lying on his bed with his booted feet propped one atop the other on the coverlet, he stared up at the canopy and tried to put his thoughts in order. He could disregard the thunderstorm outside, but Min, snuggling under his arm, was another matter. She did not try to distract him. She just did it without trying. What was he to do about her? About Elaine and Avienda? Those two were only vague presences in his head at this distance from Camelin. At least, he assumed they were still in Camelin. Assuming was dangerous when it came to those two. All he had of them at the moment was a general sense of direction and the knowledge they were alive. Min's body was pressed tight against his side, though, and the bond made her as vibrant inside his head as she was in the flesh. Was it too late to keep Min safe? To keep Elaine and Avienda safe? What makes you think you can keep anyone safe? Luz Theron whispered in his head. The dead madman was an old friend now. We are all going to die. Just hope that you aren't the one who kills them. Not a welcome friend, just one he could not rid himself of. He no longer feared killing Min or Elaine or Avienda, any more than he feared going mad. Madder than he already was, at least, with a dead man in his head and sometimes a foggy face he could almost recognize. Did he dare ask Cad Swain about either one? Trust no one, Luz Theron murmured, then gave a wry laugh. Including me. Without warning, Min punched him in the ribs hard enough to make him grunt. Getting melancholy, sheepherder, she growled. If you're worrying about me again, I swear I'll... She had so many different ways of growling, Min did. Each matched to very different sensations through the bond. There was the light irritation he felt from her now, this time touched with worry, and sometimes there was a sharp edge, as if she were refraining from snapping his head off. There was a growl that almost made him laugh from the amusement in her head, or as close to laughing as he had come in what seemed a very long time, and a throaty growl that would have heated his blood, even without the bond. None of that now, she said warningly, before he could move the hand resting on her back, and rolled off the bed to her feet, tugging her embroidered coat straight with a reproving look. Since bonding him, she was even better at reading his mind, and she had been good enough before. What are you going to do about them, Rand? What is Cad Swain going to do? Lightning flashed in the windows, almost bright enough to wash out the lamps, and thunder boomed against the window glass. I haven't yet been able to see what she was going to do ahead of time, Min. Why should today be different? The thick feather mattress sagged beneath him as he swung his legs over the side and sat up facing her. He almost pressed a hand to the old wounds in his side without thinking, then caught himself and changed the movement to buttoning up his coat. Half-healed and never healing, those two overlapping wounds hurt since Shada Logoth. Or maybe he was just more aware of how they throbbed. The heat of them a furnace of fever, trapped in an area smaller than the palm of his hand. One, at least he hoped, would begin to heal with Shada Logoth gone. Maybe there had just not been enough time yet for him to feel any difference. It was not the same side that Min had fisted. She was always gentle with that, if not always with the rest of him. But he thought he had kept the pain hidden from her. No point in giving her something more to worry over. The concern in her eyes and in her head must be about Cad Swain. Or the others. The manor house and all of its outlying buildings were crowded now. It had seemed inevitable that sooner or later someone would try using the waters left in Kyrian. Their Aes Sedai had not blared that they were going off to find the dragon
D-Man,
before.
how you doing, brother?
Neither had they been particularly secretive.
Hope you're doing well.
Even so, he had never anticipated those who had arrived with them. Davram Bashir, with 100 of his Saldean light horse, dismounting in a wind-driven
How's your
rain and muttering
night
about
going,
ruined saddles.
D-Man?
Over half a dozen black-coated Ashaman, who for some reason had not shielded themselves from the downpour. They rode with Bashir, but it had been like two parties arriving, a little distance between them always, a strong whiff of watchful wariness. And one of the Ashaman was Logain Ablar. Logain? An Ashaman wearing the sword
Hell
dragon
yeah,
on his
D-Man.
collar. Bashir and Logain both wanted to talk to him, but not in front of anyone,
Hopefully
especially
he
each
has
other,
some
it
good
seemed.
luck on that second interview,
Unexpected
brother.
or not, though, They were
Hopefully
hardly
you
the
get the
most
job.
surprising of the visitors. He had thought the 8 Aes Sedai must be more friends of Cadsuane, yet he would swear she had been as surprised as he to see most of them. Odder, all but one seemed to
Got
be
me a
with the
nice
Asheville.
little
Not prisoners,
used
certainly
gaming
not
chair I
dogs.
got from
But Logain had been reluctant
our
to explain
neighbor.
with Bashir present, and Bashir reluctant to leave Logain the
The
first
only
chance
thing
to
it
talk to
has
Rand
is,
alone.
well, it's used
Now they were all
and
drying off and settling into their
it
rooms.
just has one
He began to
armrest
try to
instead
put his
of
thoughts in
2,
order,
but
to the extent that he
can't
could,
beat
with
it.
Min
Still
close by.
a lot better than what I
would
was
Cadsuane
sitting in.
do? Well, he had tried to ask her advice. Events had outrun both of them, though. The decision had been made, whatever Cadsuane thought. Lightning flashed again in the windows. Lightning seemed to suit Cadsuane. You could never tell where it would strike. Olivia would finish her, Luce Theron muttered. She's going to help us die. She'd remove Cadsuane for us if you tell her to. I don't want to kill her, Rand thought at the dead man. I can't afford for her to die. Luce Theron knew that as well as he, but the man grumbled under his breath anyway. Since Shadar Logoth, he seemed a touch less mad sometimes. Or maybe Rand was a touch more. After all, he took to talking to a dead man in his head as a matter of every day. And that was hardly sane. You'll have to do something, Min muttered, folding her arms beneath her breasts. Logain's aura still speaks of glory. Stronger than ever. Maybe he still thinks he's the real dragon reborn. And there's something dark in the images I saw around Lord Davram. If he turns against you or dies, I heard one of the soldiers say, Lord Dobrain might die. Losing even one of them would be a blow. Lose all 3, and it might take you a year to recover. If you've seen it, then it's going to happen. I have to do what I can, Min, not worry over what I can't. She gave him one of those looks women had in great store, as if he were trying to start an argument. A scratching at the door brought his head around and made Min shift her stance. He suspected she had slipped a throwing knife out of her sleeve and was hiding it behind her wrist. The woman carried more knives tucked about her than Tom Marilyn had. Or Matt. Color whirled in his head, almost resolving into... what? A man on a wagon seat?
Yeah, I like how you did that,
appeared in his thoughts
that
anyway,
Spider-Man
and the scene was
one,
gone in an
D-Man.
instant, without
How you
any of
put
the
the
dizziness that
Spider-Man in
accompanied
the
face.
bottom.
Come, he called, standing up. Elsa spread her dark green skirts in an elegant curtsy when she entered, her eyes bright on his face. A pleasant-appearing woman, and coolly complacent as a cat, she hardly seemed to see Min. Of all the sisters who had sworn to him, Elsa was the most eager. The only eager one, really. The others had their reasons for swearing, their explanations, and of course Baron and the sisters who came to find him at Demise Wells had no real choice facing a Taviran. But for all Elsa's outer coolness, she seemed to burn inside with a passion to see he reached Tarmangaiden.
Hell yeah,
I said to let you know
D-Man.
when the Ogier came, she said,
That's
never taking
badass.
her eyes from his face. Loyal! Min shouted gleefully, tucking the knife back up her sleeve as she rushed past Elsa, who blinked at the sight of the blade. I could have killed Rand for letting you get off to your room before I saw you. The Bond said she did not mean it. Not
Yeah, I was working on mine earlier today, too.
Thank you, Rand told Elsa.
Gotta get back on it again tomorrow and try to finish it off.
Light laughter and Loyal's quake of Ogier mirth, like the earth laughing. Thunder rolled across the sky. Perhaps the Aes Sedai's passion extended to wanting to know what he said to Loyal, because her lips thinned and she hesitated before making another curtsy and sweeping out of the bedchamber. A brief pause in the sounds of pleasure announced her passage across the sitting room, and their resumption her departure. Only then did he seize the power. He tried never to let anyone see him do that. Fire flooded into him, hotter than the sun, and cold to make the worst blizzard seem spring, all a swirling rage that dwarfed the storm outside, threatening to scour him away for a moment's inattention. Seizing Saidin was a war for survival, but the green of the cornices was
This
suddenly
is the
greener.
same one
The
that
black of his
I've had on
the gold
Crossroads
its
of
embroidery more
Twilight.
golden. He could see the
by,
grain of the
Robert
vine-carved
Jordan.
bedposts, see faint marks left by the craftsman's sanding.
Because I'll
all
play
those
the
years
same
ago.
book until it ends.
Saidin made him feel as if he had been half
Because
blind
I'll
and
stop
numb
it when I
without
end my life, and then when I
That
start
was
up
part of
again,
what
I'll
he
start the book up again too.
Luce Theron whispered.
That way, no one misses
Clean
anything.
again. It was. was.
Like this book still
The
has.
foulness that had marked the male half of the
Let's
power
see
since
how
the
much
break-in
more read
was
time.
gone. That did not stop nausea.
It still
from
has
rising in
about
Rand, though.
5 hours
The violent
left.
urge to bend double and empty himself on
Like
the floor.
total read time.
The room seemed to spin for an
Or
instant.
listening time,
He had
should
to
I
put a
say.
hand on the nearest bedpost to steady himself. He did not know why he should still feel this sickness with the taint gone.
So we still got a little bit longer left
He
on
would
it.
not tell. But the sickness was the reason he could not let anyone see him take hold of Saidin, if he could help it. Elsa might burn to see him reach the last battle, but too many others wanted to see him fall. Not all of them dark friends. In that moment of weakness, the dead man reached for Saidin. Rand could feel him clawing for it greedily. Was it harder than it had been to push him away? In some ways, Luz Theron seemed more solidly part of him since Shadar-Logoth. It did not matter. He had only so far left to go before he could die. He just had to last that far. Drawing a deep breath, he ignored the lingering traces of sickness in his belly and strode into the sitting room to the crash of thunder. Min stood in the middle of the room, holding one of Loyal's hands in both of hers and smiling up at him. It took both of her hands to hold one of Loyal's, and the pair did not come close to covering it. The top of his head missed the plaster ceiling by little more than a foot. He had donned a fresh coat of dark blue wool, the bottom flaring over baggy trousers to the tops of his knee-high boots. But for once his pockets did not bulge with the angular shapes of books. Eyes the size of teacups lit up at the sight of Rand, and the grin on his wide mouth really did split his face in two. The tufted ears sticking up through his shaggy hair quivered with pleasure.
Lord Algarin has Ogier guest rooms, Rand,
He boomed in a voice like a deep drum.
Can you imagine it? 6 of them. Of course, they haven't been used in some time, but they're aired out every week, so there isn't any mustiness. And the bed sheets are very good linen. I thought I'd be back to doubling myself up in a human-sized bed. We aren't staying here long, are we?
His long ears sagged a little, then began to twitch uneasily.
I don't think we should. I mean, I might get used to having a real bed, and that wouldn't do if I'm going to stay. I mean, well, you know what I mean.
I know, Rand said softly. He could have laughed at the Ogier's consternation. He should have laughed. Laughter just seemed to have escaped him lately. Spinning a web against eavesdropping around the room, he knotted it so he could release Saidin. The last traces of nausea began to fade immediately. He could control the sickness usually, with an effort, but there was no point when he did not have to. Did any of your books get wet? Loyal's main concern coming in had been to check on his books. Suddenly it struck him that he had thought of what he had done as spinning a web. That was how Luz Theron would put it. That sort of thing happened too often. The other man's turns of phrase drifting into his head, the other man's memories mingling with his. He was Randall Thor, not Luz Theron Telamon. He had woven a ward and tied off the weave, not spun a web and knotted it. But the one came to him as easily as the other.
My essays of Willem Menetjes got damp,
Loyal said disgustedly, rubbing his upper lip with a finger the thickness of a sausage. Had he been careless shaving, or was that the beginning of a mustache beneath his wide nose?
The pages may spot. I shouldn't have been so careless, not with a book. And my book of notes took some wet too. But the ink didn't run. Everything is still readable, but I really need to make a case to protect.
Slowly, a frown crept onto his face, dangling the long ends of his eyebrows onto his cheeks.
You look tired, Rand. He looks tired, Min.
He's been doing too much, but he's resting now, Min said defensively, and Rand did smile. A little. Min would always defend him, even to his friends. You are resting, sheepherder, she added, letting go of Loyal's huge hand and planting her fists on her hips. Sit down and rest. Oh, sit down, Loyal. I'll put a crick in my neck if I keep staring up at you. Loyal chuckled, the bellowing of a bull muted in his throat, as he examined one of the straight-back chairs dubiously. Compared to him, it seemed a chair made for a child.
Sheepherder. You don't know how good it is to hear you calling him sheepherder, Min.
He sat down cautiously. The plain-carved chair creaked under his weight, and his knees stuck up in front of him.
I am sorry, Rand, but it is funny. and I haven't heard much to laugh at these past months.
The chair was holding. With a quick glance toward the hall door, he added, a little too loudly,
Carlden doesn't have much sense of humor.
"You can speak freely," Rand told him. "We're safe behind a ward." He'd almost said behind a shield, which was not the same thing, except that he knew it was. He was too weary to sit, just as he was too tired to find sleep easily most nights. His bones ached with it. So he went to stand in front of the fireplace. Winds gusting across the chimney top made the flames dance on the split logs and sometimes let a small puff of smoke into the room, and he could hear the rain drumming away at the windows, but the thunder seemed to have moved on. Maybe the storm was ending. Clasping his hands behind his back, he turned away from the fire. "What did the elders say, Loyal?" Instead of answering straight away, Loyal looked at Min as if seeking encouragement or support. Perched on the edge of a blue armchair with her knees crossed, she smiled at the Ogier and nodded, and he sighed heavily, a wind gusting through deep caverns.
Carlden and I visited every steading, Rand. All but steading Shanghai, of course. I couldn't go there, but I left a message everywhere we went. And Daiting isn't far from Shanghai. Someone will carry it there. The Great Stump is meeting in Shanghai, and that will attract crowds. This is the first time a Great Stump has been called in 1,000 years. Not since you humans fought the War of the 100 Years. And it was Shanghai's turn. They must be considering something very important, but no one would tell me why it was called. They won't tell you about any stump until you have a beard,
He muttered, fingering a narrow patch of stubble on his broad chin. Apparently he intended to remedy his lack, though it was not certain that he could. Loyal was over 90 years old now, yet for an Ogier, that was still a boy. "The elders?" Rand asked patiently. You had to be patient with Loyal, with any Ogier. They did not see time the way humans did. Who among humans would think of whose turn it was after 1,000 years? And Loyal tended to go on at length, given half a chance. Great length. Loyal's ears twitched, and he gave Min another look, received another encouraging smile in return.
Well, as I said, I visited all the steading but Shanghai. Carlden wouldn't go inside. He'd rather sleep every night under a bush than be cut off from the source for a minute.
Rand did not say a word, but Loyal raised his hands from his knees, palms out.
I'm getting to the point, Rand. I am. I did what I could, but I don't know whether it was enough. The steading in the borderlands told me to go home and leave matters to older and wiser heads. So did Shadun and Mardoon in the mountains on the Shuttle Coast. The other steading agreed to guard the way gates. I don't think they really believe there's any danger, but they agreed. So you know they will keep a close guard. And I'm sure someone will take word to Shanghai. The elders in Shanghai never liked having a way gate right outside the steading.
Right back.
I must have heard Elder Hammond say 100 times that it was dangerous. I know they'll agree to have it watched.
Rand nodded slowly. Ogier never lied, or at least the few who made an attempt were so poor at it that they seldom tried a second time. An Ogier's word was taken as seriously as anyone else's sworn oath. The way gates would be guarded closely, except for those in the borderlands and the mountains south of Amadisia and Tarabon. From gate to gate, a man could journey from the spine of the world to the Arith Ocean, from the borderlands to the Sea of Storms, all in a strange world somehow outside of time, or maybe alongside it. 2 days walking along the ways could carry you 100 miles or 500, depending on the paths you chose, and if you were willing to risk the dangers. You could die very easily in the ways, or worse. The ways had turned dark and corrupted long ago. Trollocs did not care about that, though, at least not when they had Murdrol driving them. Trollocs cared only for killing, especially when they had Murdrol driving them. And 9 way gates would remain unwatched, with the danger that any of them might open up to let out Trollocs by the tens of thousands. Setting any sort of guard without the steading's cooperation might be impossible. Many people did not believe Ogier existed, and few of those who did wanted to meddle without leave. Maybe the Ashraman, if he had enough he could trust. Suddenly, he realized that he was not the only one who was tired. Loyal looked worn and gaunt. His coat was rumpled and hung loosely on him. It was dangerous for an Ogier to be outside the steading too long. Loyal had left his home a good 5 years ago. Maybe those brief visits over the last few months had not been enough for him. Maybe you should go home now, Loyal. Steading Shanghai is only a few days from here. Loyal's chair creaked alarmingly as he sat bolt upright. His ears shot upright too, in alarm.
My mother will be there, Rand. She's a famous speaker. She would never miss a great stump.
She can't have come all the way back from the Two Rivers already, Rand told him. Loyal's mother was supposedly a famous walker, too. Yet there were limits, even for Ogier.
You don't know my mother.
Loyal muttered, a drum booming darkly.
She'll still have Aerith in tow, too. She will.
Min leaned toward the Ogier, a dangerous light in her eyes. The way you talk about Aerith, I know you want to marry her. So why do you keep running from her? Rand studied her from the fireplace. Marriage. Avienda assumed that he would marry her, and Elaine and Min as well, in the Aiel fashion. Elaine appeared to think so too, strange as that seemed. He thought she did. What did Min think? She had never said. He should never have let them bond him. The bond would smother them in grief when he died. Loyal's ears trembled with caution now. Those ears were one reason Ogier made poor liars. He made placating gestures as though Min were the larger of them.
Well, I do, Min. Of course I do. Aerith is beautiful and very perceptive. Did I ever tell you how carefully she listened to me explain about... of course I did. I tell everybody I meet. I do want to marry her, but not yet. It isn't like with you humans, Min. You do everything Rand asks. Aerith will expect me to settle down and stay home. Wives never let a husband go anywhere or do anything, if it means leaving the steading for more than a few days. I have to finish my book, and how can I do that if I don't see everything Rand does? I'm sure he's done all sorts of things since I left Kyrian, and I know I'll never get it all down right. Aerith just wouldn't understand. Min, are you angry with me?
What makes you think I'm angry? She said coolly. Loyal sighed heavily, so clearly in relief that Rand almost stared. Light, the Ogier actually thought she meant she was not angry. Rand knew he was feeling his way in the dark when it came to women, even men, maybe especially men. But Loyal had better learn a lot more than he already knew before he married his Aerith. Otherwise, she would skin him out like a sick goat. Best to get him out of the room before Min did Aerith's job for her. Rand cleared his throat. Think on it overnight, Loyal, he said. Maybe you'll change your mind by morning. Part of him hoped Loyal would. The Ogier had been too long from home. Another part of him, though, he could use Loyal, if what Olivia had told him about the Shanchan was true. Sometimes he disgusted himself. In any case, I need to talk to Bashir now. And Logain. His mouth tightened around the name. What was Logain doing in Ashaman Black? Loyal did not stand. Indeed, his expression grew more troubled, ears slanting back and eyebrows drooping.
Rand, there is something I need to tell you about the Aes Sedai who came.
Lightnings flared anew outside the windows as he went on, and the thunder crashed overhead harder than ever. With some storms, a lull only meant the worst was coming. I told you to kill them all when you had the chance, Luce Theron laughed. I told you.
Are you positive they've been bonded, Samitsu? Katsue asked firmly, and loudly enough to be heard over the thunder booming on the manor house's rooftop. Thunder and lightning fit her mood. She would have liked to snarl. It required a goodly measure of her training and experience to sit calmly and sip hot ginger tea. She had not let emotion get the upper hand in a very long time, but she wanted to bite something or someone. Samitsu held a porcelain cup of tea, too, but she had yet to swallow a drop, and she had ignored Katswain's offer of a chair. The slender sister turned from peering into the flames of the left-hand fireplace, the bells in her dark hair jingling as she shook her head. She had not bothered to dry her hair properly, and it hung damp and heavy down her back. Her hazel eyes were uneasy. It's hardly the sort of question I could ask a sister, now is it, Cadswain? And they certainly didn't tell me. As who would? At first I thought maybe they had done like Maurice and Caril, and poor Daigyan. A brief wince of sympathy crossed her face. She knew in full the pain that was gnawing at Daigyan over her loss. Any sister beyond her first warder knew that too well. But it's plain Tauvain and Gabrella are both with Logain. I think Gabrella is betting him. If there's bonding been done, it was the men who did it. Turnabout, Cadswain muttered into her tea. Some said that turnabout was fair play, but she had never believed in fighting fair. Either you fought, or you did not, and it was never a game. Fairness was for people standing safely to one side, talking while others bled. Unfortunately, there was little she could do beyond trying to find a way to balance events. Balance was not at all the same as fairness. What a dog's dinner this was turning into. I'm glad you gave me at least a little warning before I have to face Tauvain and the others, but I want you to return to Kyrian the first thing tomorrow. There was nothing I could do, Cadswain, Samitsu said bitterly. Half the people I gave an order had begun checking with Sashal to see if it was right, and the other half told me to my face she'd already said different. Lord Bashir talked her into turning the warders loose. I have no idea how he found out about them in the first place, and she talked Soralia into it, and there wasn't the least thing I could do to stop it. Soralia was behaving as if I had just abdicated. She doesn't understand, and she made it plain she thinks I'm a fool. There's no point at all in me going back, unless you expect me to carry Sashal's gloves for her. I expect you to watch her, Samitsu. No more than that. I want to know what one of these dragon-sworn sisters does when neither I nor the wise ones are looking over their shoulders and holding a switch. You've always been very observant. Patience was not always her strongest trait, but sometimes it was required with Samitsu. The Yellow was observant and intelligent and strong-willed most of the time, not to mention the best alive at healing, at least until the appearance of Dahmer Flynn. But she could suffer the most astonishing collapses in her confidence. The stick never worked with Samitsu, but pats on the back did, and it was ridiculous not to use what worked. As Cadswain reminded her how intelligent she was, how skilled at healing, that was always necessary with Samitsu. She could go into a depression over failing to heal a dead man. How clever the Arafellan sister began to draw up her composure and her self-assurance. You can be assured Sashal won't change her stockings without I know it, she said crisply. In truth, Cadswain expected no less. But if you don't mind me asking, with her confidence restored, Samitsu's tone made that the merest courtesy. She was no shrinking flower except when her self-assurance weakened. Why are you here at the back end of Tyr? What's young Althor going to do? Or should I say, what are you going to have him do? He intends something very dangerous, Cadswain replied. Lightning flashed outside the windows, sharp silver forks in a sky near as dark as night. She knew exactly what he intended. She just did not know whether to stop it.
It has to end, Rand thundered, echoed by the crashes in the sky. He had doffed his coat before this interview and rolled up his shirt sleeves to bear the dragons twined around his forearms in scarlet and gold, the golden-maned heads resting on the backs of his hands. He wanted the man in front of him reminded with every look that he was facing the dragon reborn. But his hands were fists, to keep him from giving in to Luz Theron's urgings and throttling bloody Logain Ablar. I don't need a war with the White Tower, and you bloody Ashaman bloody well won't give me a war with the White Tower. Do I make myself understood? Logain, hands resting easily atop the long hilt of his sword, did not flinch. He was a big man, if smaller than Rand, with a steady gaze that gave no sign that he had been dressed down or called to account. The silver sword and red and gold dragon glittered brightly in the lamplight on the high collar of his black coat, and that itself looked freshly ironed. Are you saying release them? He asked calmly. Will the Aes Sedai release those of ours they've taken? No, Rand said curtly, and sourly. What's done can't be undone. Maurice had been so shocked when he suggested she release Norishma You would have thought he was asking her to abandon a puppy by the side of the road. And he suspected Flynn would fight as hard to hang on to Creel as she to him. He was fairly certain there was more between those two than the bond now. Well, if an Aes Sedai could bond a man who channeled, what was to say a pretty woman could not fix on a gimpy old man? You realize the mess you've created, though, don't you? As it is, the only man who can channel that Elida wants alive is me, and that only till the last battle is done. Once she learns of this, she'll be twice as hot to see you all dead any way she can manage it. I don't know how the other lot will react, but Egwene was always a sharp bargainer. I may have to tell off Ashaman for Aes Sedai to bond until they have as many of you as you do of them. That's if they don't just decide you all have to die as soon as they can arrange it too. What's done is done, but there cannot be any more. Loghain stiffened a little more with every word, but his gaze held on Rand's. It was plain as horns on a ram that he was ignoring the others in the sitting room. Minute wanted no part of this meeting, and had taken herself off to read. Rand could not make up from down in Herod Fell's books, but she found them fascinating. He had insisted Loyal remain, though, and the Ogier was pretending to study the flames in the fireplace. Except when he glanced at the door, tufted ears twitching as if wondering whether he could slip out unnoticed under cover of the storm. Davram Bashir appeared even shorter than he really was alongside the Ogier, a graying man with dark tilted eyes, a beak of a nose, and thick mustaches curving down around his mouth. He had worn his sword too, a shorter blade than Loghain's, and serpentine. Bashir spent more time peering into his wine cup than looking at anything else, but whenever his eyes touched Loghain, he unconsciously ran a thumb along his sword hilt. Rand thought it was unconscious. Taim gave the order, Loghain said, coldly uncomfortable explaining himself in front of an audience. Sudden lightning close to the house cast his face in lurid shadows for an instant, a bleak mask of darkness. I assumed it came from you. His eyes moved slightly in Bashir's direction, and his mouth tightened. Taim does a great many things people think are at your direction, he went on reluctantly. But he has his own plans. Flynn and Narishma and Manfor are on the deserters list, like every Ashaman you kept with you. And he has a coterie of 20 or 30 he keeps close and trains privately. Every man who wears the dragon is one of that group, except and he'd have kept the dragon from me if he dared. No matter what you've done, it is time to turn your eyes to the Black Tower before Taim splits it worse than the White Tower is. If he does, you'll find the larger part is loyal to him, not you. They know him. Most have never even seen you. Irritably, Rand pushed his sleeves down and dropped into a chair. What he had done made no matter to Loghain. The man knew Saidin was clean, but he could not believe Rand or any man had actually done the cleansing. Did he think the Creator had decided to stretch out a merciful hand after 3,000 years of suffering? The Creator had made the world, and then left humankind to make it what they would. A heaven, or the pit of doom, by their choosing. The Creator had made many worlds, watched each flower or die, and gone on to make endless worlds beyond. A gardener did not weep for each blossom that fell. For an instant, he thought those must have been Lews Theron's reflections. He had never gone on that way about the Creator or anything else that he recalled. But he could feel Lews Theron nodding in approval. A man listening to someone else. Still, it was not the kind of thing he would have considered before Lews Theron. How much space remained between them? Taim will have to wait, he said wearily. How long could Taim wait? He was surprised not to hear Lews Theron raging for him to kill the man. He wished that made him feel easier. Did you just come to see that Loghain reached me safely, Bashir? Or to tell me somebody stabbed Dobrain? Or do you have an urgent task for me, too? Bashir raised an eyebrow at Rand's tone, and his jaw tightened as he glanced at Loghain. But after a moment, he snorted so hard his thick mustaches should have shaken. 2 men ransacked my tent, he said, setting his wine cup down on a carved blue table against the wall. One carrying a note I could swear I wrote myself if I didn't know better. In order to carry away certain items. Loyal tells me the fellows who knifed Dobrain had the same sort of note, apparently in Dobrain's hand. A blind man could see what they were after with a little thought. Dobrain and I are the most likely candidates to be guarding the seals for you. You have 3, and you say 3 are broken. Maybe the Shadow knows where the last is. Loyal had turned from the fireplace as the Saldaean spoke, his ears rigid, and now he burst out.
That is serious, Rand. If someone breaks all the seals on the Dark One's prison, or maybe even just one or two more, the Dark One could break free. Even you can't face the Dark One. I mean, I know the prophecies say you will, but that has to be just a way of speaking.
Even Logain looked concerned, his eyes studying Rand as if measuring him against the Dark One. Rand leaned back in his chair, careful not to let his tiredness show. The seals in the Dark One's prison on one hand, Taim splitting the Ashaman on the other. Was the seventh seal already broken? Was the shadow beginning the opening moves of the last battle? You told me something once, Bashir. If your enemy offers you 2 targets, strike at a third, Bashir finished promptly, and Rand nodded. He had already decided anyway. Thunder rattled the windows till the casements shook. The storm was strengthening. I can't fight the Shadow and the Shan-Chan at the same time. I'm sending the 3 of you to arrange a truce with the Shan-Chan. Bashir and Logain seemed stunned into silence, until they began to argue, one on top of the other. Loyal just looked ready to faint.
Elsa fidgeted, listening to Fierl report what had occurred since she left him in Kyrian. It was not the man's harsh voice that irritated her. She hated lightning, and wished she could ward away the violent lights flashing in the windows as she had warded her room against eavesdropping. No one would think her wish for privacy strange, since she had spent 20 years convincing everyone that she was married to the pale-haired man. Despite his voice, Fierl looked the sort a woman would marry, tall and lean and quite pretty. The hard edge to his mouth only made his face more so, really. Of course, some might think it peculiar that she had never had more than one warder at a time if they stopped to think about it. A man with just the right qualifications was difficult to find, but perhaps she should start looking. Lightning lit up the windows again. Yes, enough, she broke in finally. You did the right thing, Vera. It would have been taken as odd if you were the only one to refuse to find your Aes Sedai. A sense of relief flashed through the...
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone.